It's a momentous time in the history of the world. The world's population just ticked over 8 billion. All right, that's not a precise number. We haven't counted everyone on Earth up, but it is the best estimate from the UN's global population predictions. It's hard to keep up though, because the world's growing fast by about 200,000 people a day. Between the time I started this sentence and the time I'll finish it, the world will grow by about 20 people. Population growth won't go on forever. In fact, it's already slowing down.
It's just a fundamental transformation of what a society looks like.
I want to find out what we might need to do to get ready for the future and how ready for that future we are.
A growing need for a healthcare system that can handle and respond to an aging population.
And the numbers now to 345 million people marching towards starvation.
We need to do much more, and I think we need to do it much faster.
As the world reaches 8 billion and counting. What's the most populous nation in the world? For decades, as long as we've had international records from the UN, the answer to that question has been China. But soon, China will no longer top the population list. It's about to be overtaken by India, one of the fastest growing countries in the world. And that is forecast to happen next year. Beyond bragging rights, that doesn't mean much changes immediately, but it's the first of many significant shifts in population on the horizon. But to understand the future, we have to start at the beginning. The Homo sapien population boom has happened remarkably fast. Through the ancient world, our best estimates are that the population grew very slowly, reaching maybe 230 million at the time of Cleopatra's death. We reached 500 million during the Renaissance, and there were 1 billion of us when Thomas Jefferson was US president. The 2 billion mark was reached just before the Great Depression, and things really sped up from there. Just 35 years later, there were 3 billion of us walking the earth, and since then, another billion were added every 10 to 15 years. And that gets us to today's 8 billion. But let's take a few steps back, because this point in time is where that population curve was steepest. The swinging 60s. In many countries, a time of economic prosperity. Our cities were on the move, growing fast as the world rapidly urbanised. This is when the world experienced its biggest baby boom in history. Globally, women were having, on average, 5 children each. Fertility rates, in other words, the number of children being born, are one of the biggest drivers of population growth. And 2.1 is the magic number. If fertility falls below that 2.1 level of births per woman, we expect the population to start falling. And that is where we're headed. In fact, in Europe, in North America, and Australia, New Zealand, and parts of Asia, fertility rates are below that replacement rate already.
Sort of universal trend that we're seeing around the world is declining fertility rates.
Now we're approaching the end of what we call the demographic transition, where fertility is quite low, people are living long lives.
But while fertility rates are falling, the world is still growing, for now. Where are we heading? From 8 billion today, the United Nations projects the global population will reach about 9.7 billion in 2050. But from there, things really slow down. Let's walk forward another 30 years, because the world's expected to reach about 10.4 billion in the 2080s. And that is about the peak. The UN thinks it'll stay around that number for a couple of decades, before then falling. That's one model. Another, produced by health research centre the IHME, suggests the world population might peak much sooner, in just 40 years.
Our model suggests that we expect fertility to continue to decline through the end of the century in many countries. And that's contributing to a larger and a faster global population decline than the United Nations.
Some countries are already shrinking. Many of those that are in the Balkans. There are conflicts too that can cause sudden temporary changes to populations, like in Ukraine, which is about 18% smaller than it was in 2021. Ukraine might rebound, but in the long run, it is a country that's likely to shrink, along with scores of other countries. All of these countries here are expected to be smaller in 2050 than they are today. Most of those countries are in Europe, they're in the Americas, they're in Asia.
We have now reached peak child. There will never be more children alive on the earth than there is today.
Traditionally, you can think of the demographics of the world as a pyramid. There are more younger people than there are middle-aged people, who in turn outnumber the elderly. But if we roll forward through the years, that younger generation becomes the older generation, and they'll be replaced by fewer kids. The pyramid will invert. And that's a population pattern we've never seen before. The UN projects that by 2050, a quarter of people in Europe and North America could be aged over 65.
We have much older populations now than we did a few decades ago, and we expect that to continue in the decades to come.
So sooner or later, we expect an aging population, basically everywhere on Earth. And that brings with it some challenges.
If you want people to have a good quality of life, it's expensive to provide those goods and services. And then when you have that very, very low fertility, you have fewer workers coming on board to support your aging population. So it becomes a real fiscal crisis.
That's a challenge Japan, perhaps the oldest country in the world, has been confronting for decades. Authorities there were concerned in 1998.
The number of elderly people is growing so rapidly that we're facing a big problem with the increasing financial burden. I can't say that we're providing enough public care services to meet everyone's needs.
More than a quarter of Japan's population's over 65 already, and that's continuing to climb.
We do need to be designing cities, for example, in somewhere like Australia, with a view that there are going to be many more older Australians here. So thinking about walkability, accessibility is all really, really important.
So we've got dozens and dozens of countries all expected to start shrinking, and some of them quite soon. But almost none of those countries are here in Africa. Population there is set to grow through most of the rest of the century. There are just 8 countries on Earth that are responsible for contributing more than half of the world's population growth to 2050, and most of those 8 countries are here. The others are India, Pakistan, and the Philippines. Expect that the list of most populous countries is going to change substantially in the coming decades. In fact, the projections suggest that by the end of the century, sub-Saharan Africa may well contain a third of the world's population. That's a lot of population growth in a region with some of the highest rates of extreme poverty and food insecurity. That change, coupled with conflict, war, and the effects of climate change, will only increase competition for resources.
We've made so much progress in the last 200 years, from 95% poverty to less than 10%. So much improvement. But in the last 5 years, we're going the wrong way.
Stricken by drought, Somalia in sub-Saharan Africa is facing its worst famine in half a century. The country's had several failed rainy seasons in a row. Hundreds of thousands are now at risk of extreme famine. An immediate crisis that may get more regular.
We have begun some analyses looking at the health impacts of climate change and the sort of feedback mechanism between population growth and climate change as well. I think it's fair to expect we may see more natural disasters in the decades to come due to climate change, and that certainly has an impact on health.
So that could put more pressure on agriculture, trying to grow more on less land. Technology can help there. Researchers in Sydney are working on robots using artificial intelligence to help grow more food on less land with fewer people. That could help make farming more sustainable and reduce the use of crucial resources like water.
To date, the world has managed to keep pace with food production. The key issue there, of course, has been about how that food is actually distributed.
Solving that problem might mean wealthy countries need to take a good look at what and how much we eat.
Many of us in the rich nations of the world do overconsume meat, so we eat much more than is needed for health reasons.
So we don't have a choice in it. The world is changing in some really significant ways this century. Are we ready for it? Well, you might look at how the world's handled some other big existential challenges and think, probably not. There's certainly a lot to think about. But it's worth saying, I've spoken to a lot of demographers and many of them think we can rise to the challenge.
We're really optimistic people because we've seen massive change over the past 100 years. Everyone's living longer, fewer babies are dying, fewer women are dying. So across a whole range of metrics, we're doing better than we did. And we've seen, lots of small actions creating massive change for people.
8 billion is a mind-bogglingly large number of people to imagine. It's a testament to just how successful the human race has been. And we're expecting another 2 billion before the century is out. That's not necessarily a bad thing, nor necessarily a good thing. It's just a thing. But it has a lot of consequences. 2100, 2050, they feel like they're a really long way away, but grappling with changes like this take time. So it's a thing we have to think about today.